Most people assume cold weather survival has improved in a straight line, from crude wartime bedding to today's high-tech sleeping systems. But that assumption overlooks something important. Some of the most effective cold weather sleep methods ever used in sustained field conditions were developed during the Second World War, not in laboratories but through repeated failure in real winter exposure. Soldiers learned often the hard way that warmth wasn't about owning better gear. It was about building a system that controlled heat, moisture, and ground contact at the same time. Many modern outdoor setups still miss that structural approach. If you value careful historical insight like this, subscribe to the Survival Record, because these lessons only matter if they're preserved and understood. What kept soldiers warm in the Second World War was not equipment, but arrangement. In modern outdoor culture, a sleeping bag is usually treated as a self-contained solution. In wartime winter operations, no single item was expected to do that job. Warmth came from configuration, how materials were layered, how bodies were positioned, how air and moisture were controlled. Soldiers treated sleep as an environment to be managed. Ground insulation, overhead cover, shared heat, and layered materials all worked together. When one part failed, the whole system weakened. When arranged properly, even basic materials created stable warmth in severe cold. This difference in mindset, system versus object, defined survival outcomes in winter campaigns. Early winter campaigns forced armies to learn quickly and painfully. At the beginning of the war, most armies underestimated winter exposure. Heavy blankets were issued, but they were used without structural planning. Frozen ground pulled heat from the body. Snowmelt soaked insulation. Individual sleeping arrangements left too much surface area exposed to cold air. The experience of the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front made this brutally clear. Standard bedding failed under prolonged sub-zero conditions, contributing to widespread cold injuries and reduced combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Red Army relied more heavily on collective heat retention and layered ground insulation. Survival depended less on specialized gear and more on how available materials were organized. Further north, the Finnish army refined winter field methods, shaped by long experience in extreme cold. Their practices emphasized moisture control, ground separation, and shared shelter structures, principles that later influenced formal military cold-weather doctrine. Across different fronts and different armies, the same conclusion emerged: insulation alone was never enough. The ground was the greatest source of heat loss, not the air. One of the most important wartime discoveries was that frozen ground removed heat faster than cold air. Snow, ice, and frozen soil acted as constant heat drains through direct contact. Soldiers responded by building thick ground layers beneath themselves: pine branches, folded clothing, equipment packs, or anything that created separation from the earth. Even modest elevation dramatically improved warmth. Many modern outdoor systems include insulated pads, but Second World War field arrangements often used thicker and more redundant ground layers than people carry today. The reasoning was simple. When exposure is continuous and shelter is limited, the ground is the primary thermal threat. This insight remains foundational in cold weather survival training. Moisture control became just as important as insulation. Another critical lesson involved moisture. Body heat produces sweat, breath releases vapor, snow melts. All of that moisture accumulates inside insulation, and once insulation becomes damp, its effectiveness drops sharply. Soldiers developed practical solutions. Some used simple vapor barriers to prevent moisture from reaching insulating layers. Others ventilated their sleeping arrangements deliberately to reduce condensation. Many dried gear whenever conditions allowed, even partially. These practices eventually influenced modern cold weather equipment design. Vapor barrier liners and moisture-managing materials are technological versions of techniques first developed out of necessity in wartime field conditions. The principle itself has never changed. Dry insulation retains heat, Wet insulation loses it. Shared heat often worked better than individual isolation. Modern survival culture often emphasizes individual self-sufficiency, but in World War II winter conditions, survival frequently depended on shared warmth. Sleeping in pairs or groups reduced exposed surface area and stabilized internal air temperature. Shared shelters trapped heat more effectively than isolated sleeping positions. Even minimal overhead cover reduced convective heat loss significantly. Units that used shared thermal arrangements consistently saw fewer cold injuries. Isolation increased risk, not because individuals lacked equipment, but because they lacked collective heat retention. This really reflects a fundamental difference between modern recreational exposure and sustained wartime exposure. One prioritizes independence, while the other prioritizes thermal efficiency over long periods. Layered sleeping systems allowed constant adjustment. Another defining feature of World War II sleeping arrangements was flexibility. Soldiers layered multiple materials, blankets, coats, shelter halves, ground covers, and adjusted them throughout the night. Temperature shifts, changing wind, metabolic cooling during sleep, and moisture build-up all required response. A fixed system could not adapt, but a layered system could. Instead of relying on temperature ratings, soldiers modified their sleep environment continuously. Venting, repositioning, and redistributing insulation kept thermal balance stable. This dynamic control allowed simple materials to outperform rigid systems under prolonged exposure. These wartime methods reshaped modern military cold weather doctrine. After the war, these lessons were formally studied rather than forgotten. The United States Army conducted extensive cold weather testing that confirmed many wartime field observations. Multi-layer sleeping systems, moisture barriers, and insulated ground pads became standard components of military winter equipment. These principles were later incorporated into cold weather training across NATO forces. Soldiers are taught to build thermal systems, not rely solely on individual gear. Modern modular military sleep systems still reflect this structure. They are direct descendants of wartime arrangements refined through research rather than replaced by technology. Civilian gear evolved differently because it serves a different purpose. If these systems were so effective, why don't most modern sleeping setups look like them? The answer is practicality. Wartime survival prioritized reliability in continuous extreme exposure. Civilian outdoor gear prioritizes portability and convenience over shorter durations. Redundant ground layers, shared heat arrangements, and adaptable configurations are effective, but they require more materials and more management. Lightweight modern gear trades redundancy for mobility. In most recreational environments, that trade-off works. In sustained severe cold, the system-based approach of World War II often remains more resilient. This is not a technological regression, it is a difference in priorities. The enduring lesson is that survival is structural, not material. What World War II sleeping arrangements reveal is that warmth is something constructed, not simply provided. Soldiers controlled heat flow, moisture movement, air exchange, and ground contact simultaneously. They built thermal environments using whatever materials they had. Modern equipment can perform extremely well, but only when used with the same structural awareness. History shows clearly that advanced materials do not replace sound arrangement. Simple materials used intelligently can outperform sophisticated gear used poorly. Remembering these overlooked practices keeps real survival knowledge alive. Much of World War II is remembered through battles and strategy, but survival often depended on something quieter, the ability to preserve body heat through long nights of exposure. The sleeping systems developed under those conditions represent knowledge shaped by necessity and refined through experience. They remind us that survival is rarely about owning the best tools. It is about understanding the environment deeply enough to shape it in your favor. If you value serious historical analysis that uncovers lessons like these, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who want to understand not just what happened in the past, but what it still teaches us today.